Liberty in our lifetimes in a free state of our own. That's the vision. That's the dream. We are building it in New Hampshire. I'm Eric Brakey, your host and renegade statesman for the Porcupine Report. Welcome to your source for porcupine news and free-range conversation on matters of liberty. All right, let's hop into the show. Hey there, all you porcupines, this is your host, your renegade statesman, your executive director of the New Hampshire Free State Project, Eric Brakey, coming to you for episode 106 of the Porcupine Report. We come to you every single Wednesday at 7 o'clock p.m. with a brand new episode, broadcasting on Free State Project social media pages, X and Facebook and YouTube and Spotify, and on most of your favorite podcasting apps. However you are consuming the show, please do me a favor. Go ahead and share it with a friend, or leave a positive comment. Do something to continue helping us expand and grow our audience among those who love liberty. It's very much appreciated. This is, of course, I think, the best weekly podcast to get your news and great free-range conversations on progress happening in the Liberty homeland, the Live Free or Die state, New Hampshire. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. That's when we broadcast it. I guess you could be joining us anytime, morning, afternoon, the middle of the night, whenever you're enjoying it. I'm glad that you're here. A few things I want to say before we get to our great conversation today. Of course, I want to thank our sponsors. Our first sponsor I've got right here in my hand, which is my coffee, is from Porcupine Coffee Roasting. Porcupine Coffee Roasting is a private membership association operated by Free Staters in the Free State. They import specialty grade coffee beans from all around the world, and they roast them right here in New Hampshire, and they ship it right to you. And of course, there are plenty of coffee roasting companies that don't support freedom, that don't support liberty. In fact, there's many that openly support socialism, and they hate Free Staters. Why would you want to get your coffee from those folks? Why would you want your dollars going to support tyranny? Well, with Porcupine Coffee Roasting, you get coffee that is not only delicious and caffeinates you and puts that Free State spirit in your step, you know that it's supporting freedom at the same time. So go to porcupinecoffeeroasting.com and use our discount code PORKREPORT for 15% off individual orders. Thank you to our sponsor, Porcupine Coffee Roasting. And of course, I also want to thank our second sponsor, which is the Independence Inn in Stratford, New Hampshire. The Independence Inn is owned by Free Staters, operated by Free Staters, and part of their mission is getting more liberty lovers to visit New Hampshire, to go out to Free State community events, and to get a little taste of what it's like to be a Free State porcupine for a week. So go to NHindependenceinn.com and check them out. And when you're there, if you are planning your stay, ask them about a porcupine vacation, and you can get up to 50% off your stay when you tell them the Free State Project sent you. And what is a porcupine vacation? They'll help you plan your week. You can pick any week of the year to come visit New Hampshire, and they know where all the Free State events are happening. And there's 5 different communities with active Free State events all happening within an hour's drive of the Independence Inn. So it's a great place. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere, which is wonderful. It's beautiful area, but it's in the center of everything. You can drive in 5 different directions and get to 5 different active hubs for Free State community events. So it's a great place to visit. Plan your porcupine vacation today. Thank you to our sponsors. And I also want to invite you, if you don't have your tickets for the Porcupine Freedom Festival yet, it is coming up in late June. So go to porkfest.com and get your tickets for PorcFest, where it's going to be bigger than ever, geographically speaking. We're spreading all over the Free State of New Hampshire with different clubhouses and Free Staters hosting hubs around New Hampshire and hosting events for you to come and visit. So this is a great opportunity. PorcFest this year, You get to see, we've been simulating, on a single campground for the longest time, what it could be like as we build Liberty for real in New Hampshire. Well, now, a quarter of a century into the Free State Project, we have built Liberty for real all across New Hampshire. And this is a great opportunity to come out and see it and experience it all around the state for yourself. So get your tickets at porkfest.com. That'll actually redirect you to fsp.org/porkfest. Find more information there. Get your tickets. We'll see you at the Porcupine Freedom Festival. And I also want to say thank you to all of our patrons. We just surpassed 300 patrons for the Free State Project. Our patrons, of course, support the year-round mission of the FSP as we work to promote, outreach, invite, welcome, and engage with people on every step of their journey so that they learn, they connect, they visit, they move, and they build here in the Free State. That's how we build the freest society on planet Earth. And I appreciate all of our patrons who are helping us with that mission. And of course, for being a patron, you get plenty of benefits. You get access to our patron exclusive Signal group. You get access to patron exclusive print quarterly newsletters. I got to start writing the next one. You get all kinds of benefits, including complimentary tickets for FSP events at certain tiers. So go to fsp.org/give, become a patron for as little as $100 a year. It makes a big difference. It is greatly appreciated. And while you're there, of course, sign up for the Free State Project newsletter. It's the water cooler talk here in the Free State. All the great things that are happening, you will be in the know when you sign up for the Free State Project newsletter. And that, of course, is free of charge. Well, the cost is your email address. So give us your email address, get our newsletter. And of course, it's a great way to communicate directly with me. You can just hit reply to any newsletter, and I get it. Get your feedback, and it's always appreciated. All right. I think those are the things we wanted to promote. Let's hop into the conversation we're going to have this week, which is with gentleman I've been getting to know a little bit better. He's an active presence at the New Hampshire State House. He's been a leading voice on a number of issues, including a right to try and biotechnology. That is we're going to be talking about a little bit of these things. He spoke about some of these topics at the New Hampshire Liberty Forum. As a bonus to you, we're going to actually play his remarks on right to try and biotech freedom here in New Hampshire. We're going to be playing that at the end of the episode if you want to stick around for that. He's also been working on a number of issues. I guess he's got a wide range. Even he's working to kind of reclaim the islands of the Portsmouth Harbor from Maine to reclaim them for New Hampshire, which is, believe it or not, an issue that's getting some traction in the New Hampshire legislature. Perhaps we'll talk about that a little bit. His name is Ian Huyett, and let's welcome him to the show.
Eric, thank you very much. Thank you for having me on, and thank you for hosting me at the Liberty Forum. I had a great time.
Well, I'm glad that you joined us. When I found out as we were talking before all of that, I think we were on the phone, and you're like, we ended up talking about like Tom Woods and Scott Horton, all these things. And like, okay, well, Ian is like a real actual fellow traveler then in the fight for liberty if he knows all these folks and anyway, a lot of the folks who inform a lot of my views. So Ian, I appreciate all the work that you've been doing, and I'm sure I didn't give you the full proper introduction. So if you want to introduce yourself for those who don't know you, we could start there.
Yeah, this was the first time I'd seen Tom Woods in person, believe it or not, in a decade, although I listened to his podcast all the time. When I was in undergrad, I was president of my college's Young Americans for Liberty chapter, and I was a Ron Paul caucus proxy in 2012 and all that. And I hosted the statewide YL conference for the year, and Tom Woods was our keynote speaker. And I told Tom Woods that at the conference. I said, you don't remember this, but it's been, a decade plus. And he specifically remembered specific details about that conference. So that was amazing. And yeah, I'm Ian Huyett. I'm a lobbyist and a litigator. My full-time job is I am the associate director and head of litigation at Cornerstone, which is New Hampshire's only full-time Christian advocacy organization. We advocate for 100 plus churches around the state in Concord and the courts of all different kinds of Christian denominations. And then I'm a volunteer board member right now of the New Hampshire Blockchain Council and also of Granite Bioinnovation, which is a nonprofit advocacy group that advocates for making New Hampshire an experimental biotech hub.
Seem like a bit of a renaissance man, Ian. You seem like you're working on a lot of different issues that not everyone would kind of necessarily put in the same pot, except for the maybe the underlying principle of liberty.
I like to be intellectually stimulated, but also there's a common thread there, which is all of those things to me are rooted in the potential of New Hampshire. I think something that differentiates me from some other people kind of in our orbit is I care deeply about protecting civil liberties. I mean, I really became a constitutional litigator because I wanted to protect things like free speech, religious liberty, and I care about protecting the full range of individual liberties. But I'm not going to be satisfied by just a state of New Hampshire that has very robust individual liberty protections. I want to see a thriving, booming New Hampshire economy. I want to see the population of the state growing and people having young families here and communities thriving in New Hampshire. And I want New Hampshire to offer an alternative model, somewhat analogously, you could say, to the way that kind of Florida has in the past few years, to the economically robust blue states. I don't think that red states or liberty-oriented states should accept that they're just places where you don't have to pay taxes. I think we should want the states that are aligned with us to actually be competitive in their economic performance and the culture they produce. And that's ultimately a central part of how we win.
Let me ask you, big picture, New Hampshire. So I appreciate. I was re-listening to some of your remarks. I need to go back and re-listen to the Portsmouth, harbor remarks. But I was re-listening to your biotech freedom remarks at Liberty Forum, which of course we'll play at the end for those who are interested. And I think you made a very compelling case that New Hampshire is uniquely situated. If we lean in and take advantage of some of the opportunities that are available, that are emerging right now, that New Hampshire is uniquely situated to be, a world-class leader in this area. Could you break that down for the audience, and why do you think so? What are the opportunities? What are some of the policy changes that have been put in place, led by the Liberty wing in the legislature, that put us there, and I guess where else you want to take it?
Yeah, so I'll start with New Hampshire's strategic position when it comes to biotech freedom and innovation. So there are a few areas I feel like where we need to recognize in our sort of doctrine of how to grow the New Hampshire economy that New Hampshire has unique positional advantages or rare positional advantages, like our capacity to be a leading state in nuclear power innovation. I think we're probably in the top handful of states. I mean, certainly the top 10, maybe the top 5. When it comes to biotech innovation and becoming a biotech innovation hub, I think without question, New Hampshire is the number one most well-positioned state. We have a whole range of factors that all sort of converge to make New Hampshire the best state in the country to create a hub of innovative biotech. And right now is a critical time to consider this question of what states in America can be innovative biotech hubs, because we're on the precipice of a biotech revolution. Anyone who follows developments in biotech knows this. Biotech is going to accelerate beyond what we could have comprehended just a few years ago in the near future.
Could you define biotech for those who may be more lay people around this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I'm defining it a little bit more narrowly than like the FDA might define it. And I'm thinking of any sort of manipulation of the processes of the human body to combat suffering, disease, deformity, various kinds of natural ailments, to make us as healthy as we can possibly be and to promote human flourishing using science and technology. I guess that's kind of my broad working definition of biotech for political purposes. And, for example, there's anyone who sort of follows biotech developments on Twitter knows that we're on the precipice of a renaissance or a revolution in things like individualized gene therapy or individualized cancer vaccines. And that's a good example of the kind of innovative or experimental biotechnology that New Hampshire is ideally positioned to capture and take advantage of. Most of the problems holding back the development of biotech in the United States are regulatory and legal. And that's part of why we see American biotech innovation increasingly going overseas to other jurisdictions. That's why just a month ago I mentioned in my talk at Liberty Forum, the FDA's director and chief medical and science officer put out a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine where they acknowledged we're on the precipice of this revolution in bespoke or individualized therapies, and there's really no workable way under the current federal regulatory regime to accommodate this at commercial scale. We need a new system. And states are ideally positioned to build the new systems that we need to create legal pathways for experimental biotech, both for black letter law reasons. So under just kind of clear-cut, undisputed legal principles, states can do things like they can manipulate and rearrange the civil liability regime that determines what risk you have when you invest in or develop a therapy. And we've seen under the right to try laws that many states have enacted over the past decade that states can use sort of de facto federalism to create legal regimes that go around or circumvent many federal regulatory problems. And New Hampshire is the best positioned state in the country to do both of these things and to use policy innovation to create a hub of experimental biotech because of our proximity to Boston. Boston is now the largest biotech hub in the world by density. There's 120 biotech companies within a 1 square mile of the Kendall Square area, which is right on I-93. We are the only politically innovative state now in New England, period. Boston is conversely the only sort of first tier metro area or leading biotech metro area where you can escape into a totally different policy regime by driving 30 minutes away. And New Hampshire, by the way, we already have got this germ of a biotech hub or ecosystem in Manchester. If you just walk around downtown Manchester and ask people what kinds of companies are in these milliard buildings, they'll tell you there are biotech companies. There are some of those factors that are totally unique that no other state has in the country. There's a biotech hub in San Francisco. There's a biotech hub in New York. In neither of those places, for instance, can people escape into a totally different policy regime by driving 30 minutes away. Montana has a fantastic right to try law, but if you're a Bay Area biotech company, you can't 30 minutes away set up your satellite clinic in Montana. It's in the middle of nowhere. So we're uniquely positioned in a way no one else is. And all these, I think, really just providential factors come together to make New Hampshire ideally positioned to create a biotech hub. And this is a biotech hub that all of America needs, I think, right now to promote American competitiveness and that humanity needs.
Well, it's certainly very encouraging. And it's I just think back to like a decade ago when I was working on Right to Try in Maine, and to see the way that I guess it was very modest to a decade ago, just like, sure. Right. Just trying to get kind of the right for, terminally ill patients with less than 6 months to live, the right to try non-FDA approved medications. And that was like a big ask at the time. And of course, with any kind of like active nullification, people are, questioning, can you even do this, and get all the pushback from the FDA. I remember in Maine, Governor Paul LePage threatening to veto the bill because he said it was too mealy mouthed. It didn't go far enough. It needed to allow for more freedom, which, is true, but it's nice to just get the camel's nose under the tent, get what you can now, and then push to open up freedoms more down the road. And of course, New Hampshire, and I'm not sure if any other New England states have come along and passed right to try, but New Hampshire did. And now New Hampshire has gone even further with the next Gen 2 right to try. And I was listening to your talk about, how it is so much of the challenge is around liability and the right for people to waive liability. What are some of the more regulatory nuances that New Hampshire is navigating around to make this a desirable place to develop biotech? And is there more that needs to be done?
So I can tell you about our current law, which Cornerstone, who I represent, directly advocated for and I think led the charge on. And then there's two important follow-on bills that Cornerstone doesn't have a direct role in, but I certainly personally support. So House Bill 701 was prime sponsored by Representative Lisa Mazer. You can get the gist of it if you look in our RSAs in 126Z3, paragraph Roman numeral 3, which has kind of the patient eligibility boundaries. And our law now is the first right to try protection in the country to create a robust civil liability waiver if you have a life-threatening illness. Now, some states, as you mentioned, their right to try law requires like you're going to die in 6 months. Mm-hmm. Our definition of life-threatening illness is the same as the FDA's compassionate use definition, which is the end point of the treatment is survival, or the illness is going to kill you in the ordinary course of the illness. Mm-hmm. So if you fall within that category, you're eligible for New Hampshire protections. And you need to get two doctors to certify you have a life-threatening illness under this definition. You need a doctor to certify you have no FDA-approved alternative. And then if you fall within those conditions, you can get a slate of protections in New Hampshire no other state has, including a robust civil liability waiver down to the stubs. You can waive civil liability except for bad faith conduct, which is defined to include, for instance, intentionally hastening the death of the patient. So assisted suicide is not covered. You can get injunctive relief in court if you think a regulator is going to interfere with your treatment. We are the first state in the country to create specific protections around remote telehealth pre-screening. So if a provider in New Hampshire wants to have a telehealth consultation with a patient somewhere else in the country to determine whether they're eligible to participate in a clinical trial, here in New Hampshire, we're the only state to expressly protect that. And we are critically the first and only state in the country to have any right to try law that skips phase 1 protections. You can get protections in New Hampshire, even if the therapy you're trying to get has not passed a phase 1 clinical trial, with the exception of some states that have specific individualized treatment clauses, which offer somewhat analogous protections. And we have that as well. We have that specific kind of form individualized treatment language that a number of other states have passed recently. I think it's up to like 16. So that's House Bill 701, making we're the best state in the country, clearly for experimental treatments legally if you have a life-threatening illness. And tomorrow, Senate HHS is hearing two follow-on bills that passed the House just recently with every single Republican vote, actually. House Bill 1734 is a bill by Representative Stephen Kesselring, who is one of the main thought leaders on right to try in our legislature. And his bill is a copy and paste of Montana's right to try law. This is a regime where the State Department of Health and Human Services State Department of Health and Human Services licenses experimental treatment centers to offer treatments that have passed phase 1 to anyone who wants to pay for them. And then there's also House Bill 1735, which is a bill by Representative Brian Cole, and that will clean up, do some housekeeping changes to our current House Bill 701 that many people in the industry have asked for, and it will also expand the scope of our current law to encompass people with chronic and debilitating illnesses whose conditions fall short of being life-threatening. And the Senate HHS will hear those tomorrow. I don't know when this is coming out, but they will hear those bills tomorrow, Wednesday, April 1st.
Well, I imagine for most people, it should be obvious why this is good for individuals with life-threatening illnesses. More opportunities to try to save your own life. It's always the line. When you've only got X amount of time to live, should you have to wait for a 10-year FDA approval process? But of course, the problem is if they're even attempting to put that through the 10-year FDA approval process, because sometimes these illnesses are so niche and rare that it doesn't make sense to spend billions of dollars to go through that process for something that maybe a small handful of people are are threatened by. So it certainly seems to me, it should be obvious to folks that the benefits for individuals in these situations to have access to treatments like this. But Could you speak to the benefit for, I guess, what is the advantage to kind of New Hampshire, the New Hampshire economy, of New Hampshire itself being a biotech hub as things begin to take off in this field?
Well, there's not a lot of good estimates on how much people spend treating terminal illness, but it may be a good proxy for how much you could attract in terms of medical tourism for just terminal illnesses. Is the highest spending 5% of the United States spend 125 billion per year treating conditions in their final year of life. So I think it's a safe estimate that that's not just the highest spending 5% of the US population. So if you attract a substantial number of those people to receive experimental treatments in their final year of life, that could be tens of billions of dollars. I mean, 125 billion is about the current GDP of the state of New Hampshire. America has like a $5 trillion a year medical market. So even grabbing a substantial fraction of that pie, you could like replicate the entire GDP of your state if you had a state medical tourism hub. Now, in the case of New Hampshire, we can get companies in the Boston area to set up satellite offices in New Hampshire, satellite clinics to treat patients, satellite locations to engage in research or manufacturing. And they don't have to move all of their operations here. This can be done with a relatively small amount of office space, clinic space, lab space, but they've got to have some physical presence here, and they've got to work with the New Hampshire licensed physician. So people are going to need to open up clinics and to be physically present in the state in order to take advantage of these protections. And by the way, it's not just Boston. It's not just companies in the Boston area that will open up satellite offices here. Especially once you get a substantial number of these experimental biotech companies opening up shop in, let's say, the Manchester Biotech Hub, you're going to have network effects where founders of companies in California, especially as we continue to innovate and enact more and more protections, there are going to be treatments legally available in New Hampshire that aren't practically available in most other states in the country, if any other states in the country. So you're going to have unique policy advantages in New Hampshire that can attract people from even across the country. And then the network effects, the compounding network effects of building up a biotech hub are going to help facilitate that.
Let me ask you, Ian, and not to shift topics too dramatically, but I'm curious. You've been how long have you been working on policy in the New Hampshire legislature?
It's probably something like 4 years in total. I did general civil litigation for a law firm in New Hampshire. Then Cornerstone invited me to come work on constitutional issues for them. I worked for Cornerstone I need to really figure this out at some point so I can better answer these kinds of questions. But I worked for them for about a couple of years, went to go work on similar stuff in Massachusetts for about a year. And then Cornerstone invited me to come back, and been working for Cornerstone now for probably around a couple of years.
Is there... in that time, like, what do you observe about the New Hampshire legislature versus, I don't know, others? Yeah, maybe you said you did some stuff in Massachusetts. I don't know how many points of comparison you have, but it certainly does seem that there's something unique about what's about the sentiments in the New Hampshire legislature, certainly versus other states, and the openness to policy innovation, certainly in regards to, compared to the rest of New England, where policy innovation, the rest of New England is just how do we grow government?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we have in New Hampshire, there are some pros and cons to the New Hampshire political culture, and kind of working in Massachusetts for a bit did show me some areas where I think New Hampshire is at certain disadvantages. But when it comes to our politics, I mentioned almost kind of offhandedly when I was saying why New Hampshire is the best positioned state to be a biotech hub, that we're the only politically innovative state in New England. We're extremely politically innovative. It's part of the political culture of New Hampshire that we have the New Hampshire advantage, what the New Hampshire advantage means is not that we have like abundant mineral resources. It means that our political culture is oriented towards creating as much freedom as possible to attract business to the state from the surrounding kind of dense patchwork of small states.
We're like the Hong Kong of New England, surrounded by communists, and we are the one one island where you can actually kind of have some economic freedom.
And New Hampshire has this like double advantage from being politically innovative because we're in a dense patchwork of small states. And this doesn't exist many places in the US. You know, if you're out in California, there's no dense patchwork of small states. There's a handful of giant, enormous states that are like larger than many countries in the world. New England is this dense patchwork of small states. And theoretically, when you look at just basic principles of history and political philosophy, you would think that would promote lots of innovation and competition among the states. You would look at a map of New England and think this must be the place in America where like the golden age of the Greeks or the Italian Renaissance is happening, because you've got all these small little states that can compete with each other. But really, that isn't happening here because it's a political monoculture. All these states are basically uniformly identical. You know, Maine, as you know now, is in many respects to the left of Massachusetts in its policies. And so New Hampshire is really the only game in town. So we have the competitive advantage of being in a dense patchwork of small states, but compounded, because the other states really aren't competing with each other. It's just us competing with all of them.
Well, let me ask you, you mentioned Maine, and it certainly is a tragedy what's happened in Maine. I was just over in Maine endorsing a friend who's running for governor. I certainly hope he could turn things around, and they turn things around. I have my doubts about what's possible, but good on them for trying. And if they don't make it, then maybe they need to explore the Free State Project, or breaking parts of Maine off and joining New Hampshire, as I've suggested. But you're involved in an effort as well to reclaim some territory from Maine that you feel was improperly
stolen.
Okay, stolen. I guess that implies improperly. There's no way to properly steal. I mean, I guess you call it taxes, and then
that's right.
And it's proper. So there were these islands that were taxed away from New Hampshire by Maine in several decades ago. Could you tell folks a little bit about what's going on with the Portsmouth Harbor Islands?
Yeah, well, I don't know how far back in time you want me to go, but it might be helpful to give some high-level context to say, kind of in the way everyone who knows a little bit about American history knows Massachusetts was kind of the axis of New England. New England's existence kind of radiated out from Massachusetts. People left to really kind of start New Hampshire and start states like Rhode Island to get away from Massachusetts. In the same way, New Hampshire is the axis of northern New England. Maine's existence historically and Vermont's existence historically were really defined by and sort of grew out in some sense of New Hampshire. New Hampshire was one of the original 13 colonies. Maine and Vermont were not. New Hampshire was founded by Charles II in 1679. So New Hampshire has been around for century upon century. It's older than many, many countries in the world. Certainly all the countries in places like Latin America, Africa, et cetera. New Hampshire is much older than these places as a political community. And New Hampshire has, since its founding in 1679 and for about 3 centuries, it exercised control over the entire Portsmouth Harbor. The Portsmouth Harbor has some important islands in it, especially Seabees Island, which is the site of the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, which accounts for about 1% of the GDP of Maine. And it's also got an important island from a New Hampshire historical perspective that's called Badger's Island today, which used to be called Langdon's Island because it was owned by John Langdon, who was really a kind of a second-tier founding father of the U.S. He signed the Constitution. He was a senator from New Hampshire, and he was our second governor of New Hampshire. And he owned Langdon's Island and operated a shipyard there, where he built a number of ships for the Continental Congress in cooperation with the New Hampshire militia, one of which was called the USS Raleigh, which is the boat shown on the New Hampshire State Seal. And the New Hampshire State Seal depicts the USS Raleigh having just been constructed on John Langdon's island. So that's just a potent illustration of how unambiguous New Hampshire's control of these islands was. This is an island that was named after our second governor. It was known as Langdon's Island as late as the 1930s, and it's literally shown in this New Hampshire state flag. And yet, just ridiculously, today it's treated by both New Hampshire and Maine and the federal government as part of Maine, together with Seabees Island. And the more I dug when I first became interested in this, the more I dug into the history of, who controlled the harbor waters and the islands, the more I was just astonished by how utterly weak Maine's case was. New Hampshire throughout the entire, not just its kind of early colonial history, but through the entire 19th century, it exercised control over all of the harbor waters up to Pepperell Cove. Maine has very, very little affirmative evidence it can point to demonstrate any kind of control over any part of the harbor before the 1970s, when something called the Lobster War happened. And essentially a short version of how Maine got half of our harbor waters at first in the 70s, and then these two islands in the 90s, is Maine was just much more aggressive than New Hampshire was, and it cared a lot more about getting control of this stuff than sadly we cared about defending it. There was a Republican administration in the 70s that was much more interested in saving money on litigation costs and saving money on DOJ salaries than it was in fighting in the courts to stop Maine from taking our historic territory. And, Maine conversely wanted to have access to lobster fishing waters and eventually to, very profitable islands, including the island where the Naval Shipyard is located. And, that brings in about $1 billion a year into the regional economy. And so we just didn't fight hard enough. We put up a pretty good fight in the late 90s, early aughts, but it was kind of too little too late. Certain things went wrong. We left many options on the table untried to take control of at least the islands. And so I would like to see New Hampshire, ideally, I would love to see New Hampshire get back all of its historic territory, but I think it's a realistic short-term goal to get practical control of at least Seaveys Island, which is what Representative Joseph Barton is trying to do through HR 45 and HCR 8, which is now in the New Hampshire Senate.
So that resolution has passed the House. It's going to the Senate. And could you explain a little bit, what does it mean specifically if the New Hampshire legislature passes this resolution? I assume I don't know if the governor has to sign this or not, or if it's just a resolution of the legislature. What does it practically mean? Is it mostly a statement that, or does it have any kind of practical implications beyond that?
Well, it would be similar to HR 45, which has passed the House and is done now. So HR 45, because it's a House resolution, there's nothing else to do with it at this point other than it empowers the House Speaker to effectively send ambassadors from the New Hampshire State House to the White House to interface with the White House and try to get the White House to intervene. HCR 8 is the same way, but it would be a whole of government resolution. The collective government of New Hampshire would be asking the White House to intervene. And I think that'd likely carry more political force. What both of them ask, and they're basically the same, is they ask Donald Trump to order executively that the duty stations of Naval Shipyard employees will be changed to New Hampshire. And there's a long list of things that I think New Hampshire should be doing to try to get control over at least its historic harbor islands, Seaveys Island and Badgers Island. But this is kind of the most realistic and most modest short-term thing that we could do. Obviously suing Maine again in the U.S. Supreme Court is another step I'd like to take eventually. And there's a variety of other ideas that people have that could be productive. But this would just be an administrative change that Trump has very little reason not to initiate. That overnight would free the 40% of naval shipyard workers who live in New Hampshire from paying Maine income taxes. Maine did not use garnishment to collect income taxes from New Hampshire-based naval shipyard workers until 1997. And that's a very important year to remember, I think, because we controlled, from a taxation standpoint, Seaveys Island, even though we choose not to collect income taxes in New Hampshire. We effectively controlled Seaveys Island when it comes to taxation in New Hampshire from 1679 until 1997. That's a period of many, many centuries. The average resident of Wolfboro is, older than the 70s even, right? Many people in New Hampshire can remember a time when Maine exercised not the faintest scintilla of control over certainly either of these islands and ultimately any of the harbor whatsoever. So a short-term thing we can do is just get this administrative change made in terms of the federal duty station assignments. And that will mean that millions of dollars in Maine income taxes will stop coming out of the paychecks of these Granite State Naval Shipyard workers, and it will then go back into the New Hampshire economy. And that really is step one.
I mean, that sounds great to me. And I certainly know that Donald Trump, for all his faults and all the things I'm very angry with him about right now, certainly is no fan of Janet Mills. And maybe he'll take it as an opportunity to stick it to her.
Yeah, I think at least as of the past, I don't know, what are we on for? How many weeks are we into the Iran war? I'm not sure. But however far along we are, maybe you shouldn't send you or me to talk to Donald Trump, but somebody else.
Yeah. I wouldn't be a very good ambassador right now. Maybe a year ago.
Yeah, right.
But if it comes to fisticuffs between New Hampshire and Maine, I'm happy to negotiate the peace treaty. I think I know parties on both sides.
As long as we get all our land back.
Yeah. We'll start with the islands, and then we'll see about annexing Oxford County and and the rest of the second district. Other topics, I know, because you do seem to be working on a lot of different issues. You mentioned the New Hampshire Blockchain Council. Of course, this is areas around cryptocurrency and blockchain technology. New Hampshire has really been leading the nation on. I think probably no other state is in competition for that except for perhaps Wyoming. What's your assessment on New Hampshire leading in this field and some of the areas that in recent years we've seen real?
Well, on the positive side, I mean, there's no doubt New Hampshire is very legally innovative when it comes to blockchain technology, and almost singularly because of Representative Keith Hammond. Representative Keith Hammond has passed so many innovative first of the nation bills on blockchain technology. We're like a legal mecca for doing business in the blockchain space. We've got all kinds of protections nobody else has. And then most recently, something that the Blockchain Council worked on is New Hampshire became really the first government in North America to enact a law creating a state Bitcoin reserve. We beat the federal government, we beat Florida and all these other states that people thought were going to be first to the draw. New Hampshire got there before everyone else. On the other side, we really need to build up in New Hampshire a grassroots network of people who are engaged on blockchain related policy from a legislative standpoint. Because although many people in New Hampshire are invested in and passionate about blockchain technology, we don't really have that kind of formal, well-established grassroots network. And that's part of what the Blockchain Council is trying to do. And you can see an example of how this can be very advantageous when it comes to crypto kiosks. There's fortunately, as of this moment, there's not a bill that would de facto ban crypto kiosks or ATMs in New Hampshire, but many people would like there to be. And there, for a moment, it looked like there was going to be one. And you have groups like the AARP that are constantly demanding a de facto ban on all crypto kiosks, all ATMs. And they've basically enacted this in surrounding states like Vermont. And to attend some of these legislative hearings on this issue, you would think that New Hampshire was a very anti-crypto state full of people who are champing at the bit to just ban all crypto and blockchain businesses and sort of drive them out of the state. And that, I think that is just a sign that we can't just assume that, because we voted, everything's going to be okay from a legislative standpoint when it comes to blockchain policy, especially. We've really got to activate and build up more robust grassroots networks of pro-blockchain activists.
It is it's funny. I mentioned that I was at an event endorsing a friend running for governor in Maine. And while I was there, I bumped into a guy who's thinking about making the move to New Hampshire, actually, which is welcome. If things don't work out in Maine this election cycle, we'll see what happens. And he was a co-owner of a group in Maine called Maine Bitcoin LLC, and they were Bitcoin ATMs, throughout Maine. And I think some of them were, across the board. I said, I know the guy who's a free stater who programmed, the first four commercial use Bitcoin ATMs, Matt Whitlock, who's been a guest on this show. And he says, oh yeah, those are the ATMs that we used, but they're illegal now in Maine. They been driven out of business by a law that was passed that basically said they can charge no more than like 3% fees which I think was 3%, which just totally destroys their business model. And it's government kind of coming in and putting kind of price controls in, and anyway, so they're out of business now, right? And people are cut off from access to these new technologies. So it is certainly, we see it happening all around us. So it is good to raise the flag that it could happen here, and it is kind of engagement and grassroots pressure that can stop that from happening.
Yeah. Well, look up New Hampshire Blockchain Council and follow our updates if you want to learn more.
Yeah. And are you involved in some of the, I haven't followed it nearly as closely as I would like to, but are you involved in any kind of the nuclear energy policy talks that are going on? Or are you just kind of a well-wisher like I am?
I'm a well-wisher. Yeah, I'm certainly passionate about it. I think that's certainly got to be a critical part of kind of the economic doctrine of how we grow the state of New Hampshire. But when it comes to biotech, I followed very closely every single legal development that happens in the law and experimental biotech space. I'm not in the same position of knowledge when it comes to nuclear, but I think it's safe, reliable, common sense technology that's a natural path forward for New Hampshire.
Awesome. I know it's fascinating to just remember, like 10 years ago, I was like, writing the platform planks for the National Republican Party on right to try and modular nuclear reactors with thorium and all of that. And it was kind of like, a lot of these things were kind of pipe dreams to see kind of real freedom in these areas. And, of course, it's the free state in New Hampshire where these dreams are becoming realities. And so it's been very encouraging to see. I don't know all the ins and outs of, but you see kind of good talk coming from the governor's office and executive orders, and real policy innovation from the legislature around nuclear power. So, anything else? Anything else? We've covered awesome stuff happening in biotech. We've covered the islands. We've covered blockchain issues. Anything we've forgotten to cover, or anything else you think people would appreciate knowing about what you see going on at the State House, or as how New Hampshire is positioning itself to lead in the future?
Well, I should mention I talked about a previous Cornerstone bill, House Bill 701. But if you want to follow current Cornerstone bills, Cornerstone's taken positions on bills to allow biological sex separation in New Hampshire, bills to make it easier to build childcare from a zoning standpoint, 1268, a bill by Representative Noble to make New Hampshire legally the best state in the country for homeschooling. These are all Cornerstone endorsed bills. And I should also mention 1416, Representative Farrington's bill to protect pregnancy resource centers. You can learn more about all of those bills at nhcornerstone.org. And I believe every bill I just mentioned is currently before the New Hampshire State Senate, having just passed the House.
And how do you feel about the prospects of these in the New Hampshire Senate? I know that often seems like where the most exciting ideas go to be slaughtered.
Yeah, it's obviously the Senate can be more challenging than the House, but a lot of the time when, in my personal experience, typically when people have a great bill that builds up a lot of momentum in the House and then dies in the Senate, there's just not a big grassroots network of people engaged fully on the bill in the Senate. I think often that failure mode comes from people expecting the system to just naturally recognize their bill as a good bill and just process it automatically and shuffle it on through the system to the governor's desk. And, I think that's just not how human nature works. That's not how politics works at a fundamental level. You've got to have people in each district of, senators who are potential swing votes calling and emailing and checking in with their senator to advocate for the bill. And certainly if you've got any kind of innovative bill in the Senate and you've got, kind of lobbying interests that are opposed to it, for a senator who's got a lot of different bills on their plate and they're following a variety of different things, if I'm a senator, I don't have time to research every single issue under the sun, but maybe I have a lobbyist in my ear opposing the bill, and I've just got a small handful of activists who are passionate about this bill that just passed the House. That's going to naturally incline me to shoot down a bill that might have been innovative if I'd had more of my own constituents calling me. So this is just I think a lot of this comes from a cultural problem on the right, where people on the right don't want politics to be a fundamental part of their lives. And by the right, I would include, just most people who want smaller government as well in New Hampshire. They expect the system to kind of work on its own in between elections. And the left, established lobbying groups, they're often able to get more done because they just recognize at a fundamental philosophical level that's not how politics works.
Yeah, it's always the challenge. Those who love power run for office, and those who love liberty run for the hills. And not even just running for office, but just, we've got to be engaged and make sure the politicians know that what happens in legislative season has an impact in election season, and that's how you get them on board. So, Ian, I really appreciate you leading on so many issues on the, what would you say, on the edge of the Overton window, shifting in the right direction towards freedom and liberty. So I really appreciate you coming on the show. Any final thoughts you want to share? Any final plugs you want to put in before we wrap up?
Well, certainly, if you're a Christian in New Hampshire, go to nhcornerstone.org and follow our email list. If you want to see what I'm doing, you can follow me on Twitter. IanHuyett.com also has all of my links. Awesome.
Ian, thank you so much.
Thank you much.
All right, everyone. And remember, you can stick around after the episode because we are going to be playing some bonus content for you. Ian's remarks on biotech freedom and right to try in New Hampshire. So that's took place at the New Hampshire Liberty Forum just earlier this month. So be sure to stick around for that. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you again to all of our patrons. Get your tickets for PorcFest, porcfest.com, pork with a C, not a K. Learn more about PorcFest, get your tickets. And furthermore, my opinion is the Federal Reserve should be destroyed.
So I would like to argue this morning that New Hampshire has the best strategic position in the country to become a hub of experimental biotechnology through changes to our state laws. And this is not hyperbole. I think it is an objective fact. Of the 50 states, we are in singularly the best position to do this. And I want to tell you what's already happening, how this process has already started, and what the next steps are. So when it comes to experimental biotechnology, you could, roughly speaking, say there's kind of two big buckets of problems in the United States. And one is inefficiency. And the inefficiency is cancerous. So there's something that's well known to people in the experimental biotech industry called Eroom's Law, which is Moore's Law spelled backwards, if you're familiar with that. And Eroom's Law is that the number of new drugs and biologics approved per dollar invested is cut in half about every 10 years, meaning it gets harder and harder to get new drugs and biologics from start to finish. Now, this is not because we're so advanced that now we're kind of nitpicking in terms of innovation and there's some technical problem here. And one reason that we know that this isn't a problem of innovation or of technology is that the raw number of new drugs and biologics approved is always increasing. In fact, it's about doubled over the past 10 years. So the technology is getting better. In fact, we're on the precipice of a revolution in biotechnology in many different ways, but it's getting harder and harder to go from start to finish because of the federal regulatory system. The other big problem is it's kind of separate from the inefficiency problem, and that is there are some emerging therapies that really don't even theoretically have a path to mass commercialization in the United States. So we're on the precipice of a revolution in gene therapy. And we can imagine in the near future, a future where because of AI-based genome sequencing and gene editing, and also improvements in viral vectors, we can just wage war on genetic disease. We can imagine a near future where if you have any genetic ailment or illness with a genetic component, AI can look at your genome, it can identify all the pathological areas of your genome, it can print a custom gene edit, and then a viral vector can deliver that edit to all of the most pertinent parts of your body.
This is conceivable in the relatively near future. This is basically an engineering problem. We understand at a theoretical level how this could work. We just have to kind of work out some of the kinks. So if we stood on the precipice of that revolution tomorrow, if we were ready to do this, could we do it legally in the United States? And probably no. There's probably really no, even theoretically, pathway under the current federal regulatory system for us to implement that in kind of a mass commercialized way where it would be accessible to you and me. And in fact, last month, the chief medical and chief science officer at Trump's FDA, Vinay Prasad, who actually was chief medical and chief science officer until literally yesterday. He just left yesterday. But he wrote an article in the New England Journal of Medicine where he said exactly this. He said, actually, the FDA agrees that when it comes to personalized or bespoke gene therapy, we need an alternative pathway. There's no viable way to do this at scale in the United States, even if all the technology were ready to go. So what is the solution? Well, the states offer a solution here for two reasons. And there are many, many areas of law and policy regulation where there are obstructions to biotech innovation that the states can entirely solve, or where the states can at least significantly mitigate the problem. So a state like New Hampshire can decide through state law changes we're going to become a national hub of biotech innovation. This is true for, as I said, two reasons. And one is just a question of black letter law. Eric mentioned nullification, and that's true. There is some kind of quasi-nullification you can do in this area, but the first reason the states can help here is just a simple, straightforward black letter law question. So, for example, civil liability is one of the major obstacles to biotech innovation. I've talked to many patients, and I've talked to small nonprofit research foundations, mostly run by rare disease moms who have tried to get access to experimental gene therapies and other innovative cutting-edge therapies in the United States. And one of the biggest problems they've encountered is the specter of civil liability. Civil liability has been one of the biggest deterrents to gene therapy, in particular in this country, since the 90s. Now, civil liability is, everyone agrees, this is not a controversial legal position. This isn't pushing the envelope. It's not even nullification or anything like that. Civil liability can be almost completely adjusted by the plenary powers of a state legislature. 99% of all civil liability in existence, the state legislature can adjust. It can create a civil liability waiver that will be effective in almost every case. Now, the second area where states can help, you could say, is kind of quasi-nullification in the Tom Woods sense, and that is right to try. And most states in the country now have some sort of right to try law. And the basic idea of right to try is the states are saying we are going to create an alternative pathway around the federal approval system, usually in cases of special patient need, like this illness is ultimately going to kill you eventually. Therefore, we're going to create a special pathway for you around the federal system. Now, right to try operates in kind of a gray area between law and politics. And our system in the United States, where we have this structurally federalist system, and yet the black letter law says, hey, there's all these federal regulations and there's federal preemption, that creates kind of a gray area between law and politics. And the most obvious example of this gray area that everyone's familiar with, and I think this is exactly analogous in legal terms, is state legal frameworks for recreational marijuana. So Massachusetts, for example, has a $2 billion a year marijuana industry. And you could say that's not quite what someone like Tom Woods means when we say nullification. You know, Massachusetts is not saying if the DEA comes in here tomorrow, we're going to arrest the DEA agents. I mean, that would be, strictly speaking, what kind of Thomas Jefferson nullification would have been. But the thing is, nobody thinks that the DEA is going to come into Massachusetts tomorrow and arrest half of the population of Massachusetts for having a $2 billion a year recreational marijuana industry. The DEA is just not going to do that. And the first people who realized the DEA wasn't going to do that are the people who made the most money from investing in these industries in these states. So right to try is very similar. Right to try laws are about 10 years old. They've been around since 2014. As I said, most states have them. Eric Brakey, as a senator in Maine, led the charge there for Maine's right to try law. And they're not used as often as state recreational marijuana frameworks are. A good estimate that most people, I think, in this space and in the industry would agree with is that somewhere between 200 and 300 people in the U.S. over the past decade have accessed experimental therapies under state right to try frameworks. Now, there has never been a single instance ever in any state of the FDA trying to go in and do preemption in a state that has created a state right to try pathway against a manufacturer or provider. And I can say that confidently because I've been working on this for the past year. I've talked to all kinds of people in the industry who've used these laws. I've talked to patients. I've talked to providers. No one can point me to a single case of the FDA trying to come in and do preemption. Now, 200 to 300 is not that many, of course. There's also a federal right to try law, by the way, which is a complete joke. Just on its face, it really does nothing. It was pure showboating. This was signed into law by President Trump in 2018 or 2019, and since then, 16 people in the entire country have used that federal right to try framework. We know exactly how many people have used it. But 200 is better than 16, but it's not as many as we'd like. So why is it not more? Well, almost all state-level right to try laws are really limited, and this is true for political reasons because people needed to make them very limited to get them over the finish line, but they're really limited in the protections they provide and in the scope of patient eligibility. And so for that reason, over the past couple of years, we've seen a few states offer what you might call second wave right to try laws that instead of maybe just theoretically offer treatment to a dozen or so patients here and there, really create a pathway for viable commercialization of experimental therapies within the state. And the biggest examples here would be Montana, Florida, and now New Hampshire through House Bill 701, which went into effect in January. And all of these laws are very different from each other, but they all offer much broader protections and have wider patient eligibility than the traditional state right to try laws that have only helped 200 or so people. And let me tell you a little bit about some of these. Actually, before I do that, let me tell you about why New Hampshire is in the best position in the country to do this. So I think from first principles, if you were now to look at a map of the U.S. and say, let's pick a state where we can create a legal regime that is especially attractive to experimental biotechnology, I think from first principles alone, it would have to be New Hampshire. I don't see how you can even make a case for any other state. And that's true for a few reasons. And one is proximity to Boston. Boston, by density, is now the largest biotech hub in the world. The Kendall Square area of Cambridge, which is right on I-93, you could hop on I-93 and go straight from here to there. That famously has 120 biotech companies within a 1 square mile radius. Boston is a big hub of biotech innovation. New Hampshire has unique policy leverage because we are the only politically innovative state in New England. Being in a dense patchwork of small states should create competitive pressure. It should create a marketplace for policy, but it doesn't really because New England is a political monoculture. So we have this kind of compounded advantage in New Hampshire because people can easily come here by voting with their feet. They can even set up a satellite office 20, 30 minutes away. And New Hampshire is the only game in town when it comes to having innovative policies that other New England states don't have. This is also, by the way, kind of true in reverse when it comes to Boston. So if you look at the big kind of major metro areas where this kind of innovation, anything like it, is happening in America, maybe you look at San Francisco, maybe you look at New York City, maybe you look at Boston. Boston is the only one of those cities where you can get into a totally different policy regime by going 30 minutes away. If you're in San Francisco, you can't go 30 minutes away to get to Montana, for example. If you're in New York City, you're just driving through blue state after blue state for hours. Only in Boston can you just go to New Hampshire and be in a totally different policy regime. And then the last advantage we have is Manchester already has an existing biotech hub. It's sometimes called Regen Valley. Dean Kamen coined that term. If you just walk around downtown Manchester and ask people what companies are in these old mill yard buildings, they will say biotech companies. You have ARMI there, Biofab USA, Epibone, which has been involved in these right to try laws in New Hampshire. They do their manufacturing here, but they can't offer treatments here yet. They'll grow grafts of your bone or cartilage from your own stem cells. United Therapeutics, which owns Revivicor. Revivicor is currently growing human replacement hearts and lungs in pigs. And their kidneys actually are in 60-some patients right now, the U kidney in Boston, and they've got their U heart in a couple of patients expected to go into human trials this year. So much is happening in Manchester already. We have the germ of a big biotech industry. So that brings us to what's happening now in terms of legal innovation, and then what are the kind of upcoming policy innovations we can look forward to. So House Bill 701 was signed by Governor Ayotte in August of this last year, went into effect in January. Representative Lisa Mazer was the prime sponsor, and this enacted much of the text in what's now RSA 126Z, and this bill makes New Hampshire the best legal regime in the country for access to experimental therapies for people with life-threatening illness. And life-threatening illness, by the way, just means the illness will kill you eventually. It doesn't require you're going to die in 6 months or a year or anything like that. It can be something that's going to kill you 20 years from now. You can qualify under our state legal regime. Now, if you fall within that scope of patient eligibility in New Hampshire, you can get, we are the first state in the country to enact a robust civil liability waiver in our state right to try law. So our state right to try law allows you to waive civil liability basically down to the stubs. You can waive civil liability except for bad faith conduct if you fall within this circle of patient eligibility. That removes an obstacle no other state in the country has removed. We're also the first state in the country to have some right to try protections that don't require having passed a phase 1 trial. And we have some other first in the nation protections, like we create special protections for telehealth pre-screening of out-of-state patients who may want to come here to New Hampshire and receive treatment. Now, we are the best state in the country if you have a life-threatening illness, and no other state has those protections if you fall within that scope of patient eligibility. But there are other states that are doing some very innovative things that we have not done here yet, namely Montana and Florida. Now, there's 2 bills that are working their way through the system right now in New Hampshire, and both the bills I'm going to tell you about just passed House HHS committee in a party line vote. Every Republican on the committee voted for them, and every Democrat on the committee voted against them. And the Democrats, interestingly, all said very nice things about these bills. They all said, I appreciate what the bill's trying to do. I appreciate that the Republicans worked with us to kind of negotiate a compromise amendment. But these treatments are going to be available only to the ultra-rich, and therefore I'm voting against them. Doesn't really make sense to me. You know, if you and I had the same debilitating genetic illness, and I couldn't afford the treatment, but you could afford the treatment. So let's just imagine I kind of have my Marxist genie lamp, and I rub the lamp, and I wish for equality, and now the treatment disappears. Poof. Like, now we're perfectly equal, but am I better off in that situation? No, actually, I much preferred the first situation because at least the treatment existed then, and so I had some hope of receiving the treatment. So this really doesn't make sense on its face if you just kind of slightly interrogate it. But House Bill 1734 and 1735 just passed our House HHS committee, and they're working their way to the New Hampshire House floor right now. 1734 is prime sponsored by Representative Stephen Kesselring, and it will copy and paste Montana's right to try laws into the New Hampshire RSAs. Montana's framework is a bit different from ours. They don't offer all the protections we offer in New Hampshire for terminally ill people, but one thing I really like about the Montana law, and biotech companies really like, is their state DHHS in Montana will give licenses to experimental treatment centers to offer experimental therapies. And knowing everything I know now, I really like that system because it gives some kind of prospective assurance to manufacturers, providers, and to investors. Knowing more now about kind of the psychology of biotech innovators and how they think. I think that could be tremendous value add for us in New Hampshire. And that would be a separate pathway, separate from the 701 terminal illness pathway you've just heard about. You could use one or you could use both. Then there's 1735, which is prime sponsored by Representative Brian Cole. And this will do some important housekeeping to our current 701, 126Z regime. And it will also expand the scope of that protection to include people with chronic and debilitating illnesses. So, for example, if you need a bone graft or a cartilage graft, you could have a severe deformity or injury that's crippling your quality of life. You're desperate to do something like waive civil liability, but you are not eventually going to die of this illness. So this would expand the scope of patient eligibility to include you. So please contact right now. These are coming to the House floor. Contact your House representatives and ask them to vote to approve the House HHS recommendation on 1734, 1735, and especially please contact your senators and ask them to give these bills a favorable reception when they get to the Senate, and tell them that, you know, these bills, when we pass both of these, that is going to make New Hampshire, by any measure, on any level, the best legal jurisdiction in America for access to experimental therapies, period. Better than Florida, better than Montana. We will have taken the best policy ideas that everyone around the country has implemented, and we will have implemented them here. So contact your representatives and senators and tell them that becoming a hub of biotech innovation is a critical part of the Granite State advantage, and it's an essential part of the bright future that we're now building in New Hampshire. Thank you.